forces fired live rounds and tear gas. The wounded were taken to the city's main Salmania hospital. Protesters have gathered there to offer their blood and their support. Our correspondent in Manama reports.
The emergency room of Bahrain's largest hospital straining to cope as the first patients are treated. Doctors battle to save the most seriously ill. This man has a bullet lodged in his brain.
There was a rush of people, injured, casualties. There are hundreds of patients who were brought in the hospital. There are still people who are lying in the roundabout. There are still people who are thrown in the street. We don't know how many patients are there so far. And they've stopped the ambulances from going there again, once again.
For one doctor, the stress was too much. Some patients have clearly been traumatized by what's happened to them. Relatives are angry. This woman says she hopes God will bring down the Khalifa family. The hospital beds are full. These were unarmed protesters who'd been marching peacefully when the military started firing live rounds and tear gas at them.
They fired at us from all sides, using guns, rubber bullets and live ammunition. It came from everywhere, from the air, from the riot police and the Air Force. They used tear gas, really all kinds of weapons.
Outside the Salmania hospital, crowds began to grow. This had become a place of protest. Down, down, Hamid. A reference to this country's ruler, King Hamid. Hours after the troops opened fire, the injured were still being brought here to the shock of the crowd. Some of the protesters are already vowing to march again in the coming days. They say the heavy-handed tactics of the authorities will not stop them. AlJazeera, Bahrain.
Well, meanwhile, in Yemen, 6 people have been killed during the latest anti-government protests. A so-called Friday of Rage attracted thousands of people to the capital Sana'a. Demonstrations have now gone on for 8 straight days, with calls for the president to resign growing louder all the time. And these pictures are from Jordan, where at least 8 people were injured in clashes between pro- and anti-government groups. The fighting broke out in the capital Amman after Friday prayers. Protesters there are calling for more freedoms and lower food prices. This is the 7th Friday in a row on which Jordanians have rallied. In Egypt, the ruling Supreme Council of the Armed Forces has said it will not tolerate any further strikes. The army's statement was issued on Friday as millions of people filled the streets across the country to celebrate the success of their revolution and to maintain the pressure on the new military government. They still want more democratic reforms implemented. Rawia Rage reports from Cairo.
Draped in red, white and black, thousands of Egyptians come to Tahrir Square, this time not in protest, rather to mark their hard-won victory.
Contrary to the scenes of anger and frustration that lasted here in Tahrir Square for days before Hosni Mubarak stepped down, the mood this Friday is one of joy and celebrations, smiles everywhere.
And a tribute to the country's military, who even before the end of Mubarak's rule last week was hailed for not obstructing the pro-democracy movement. The military had asked Egyptians to stop their protests, but it did not prevent the gathering on Friday. Instead, Tahrir was surrounded by tanks and soldiers who searched people and regulated traffic. The gathering not only a victory march, but also a memorial to the 300+ people who lost their lives in the uprising. The highlight of the day, an appearance by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, one of Sunni Islam's most prominent clerics. In a heartfelt ceremony, he praised the revolution, the youth behind it, and the military, though he did make a direct request.
I call on the Egyptian army to liberate us from the government that Mubarak formed in his last days. We want a new government that does not include the old faces that remind people of poverty and misery.
But he also urged patience with the country's interim military leadership. The current cabinet was appointed by Mubarak before he stepped down, A reshuffle is expected in the coming few days.
I came here all the way from Upper Egypt because all I want is an end to corruption. We want this government changed. We don't want Mubarak's party members in power.
It is true that we need to be patient, but at the same time, we need to remind the government and whoever is there that we are still in the streets. And we still have a lot of other demands that they need to pay attention to.
And until they see the country's 30-year emergency law lifted and the thousands of political prisoners released, many say they will keep the pressure. Rawi Rageh, Al Jazeera, Cairo.
The United States has blocked a UN Security Council resolution that condemned Israel's settlement building in the West Bank. Instead, Washington offered up a weaker, non-binding presidential statement, effectively rejecting the legitimacy of Israel's settlements. Kristin Salumi reports from New York.
Will those in favor of the draft resolution...
The United States lobbied hard to stop this vote from happening. And when it did...
Those against...
They used their veto power to stop this resolution from becoming law.
The draft resolution has not been adopted.
The draft called for a halt to illegal Israeli settlements in Palestinian territories. Even though the Obama administration has repeatedly criticized Israel's settlement expansion, Ambassador Susan Rice said the resolution risked hardening the positions of both sides.
Our opposition to the resolution before this council today should therefore not be misunderstood to mean we support settlement activity. On the contrary, we reject in the strongest terms the legitimacy of continued Israeli settlement activity.
The Palestine Liberation Organization's executive committee met just hours before the Security Council. The United States tried convincing them to drop the vote, warning that there would be repercussions if it proceeded. The committee decided unanimously to move forward anyway.
We would have liked, of course, to have the Security Council adopt that draft resolution. But I think it was very clear that there is a global consensus on the content of the draft resolution.
The Security Council has successfully passed resolutions on Israeli settlements in the past. In 1967, it called on Israel to fully withdraw from occupied territories. And in 1979, it stated that settlements have, quote, no legal validity and constitute a serious obstruction to achieving peace in the Middle East. With the Arab world awash with demonstrations against leaders who are seen as more in line with the U.S. than their own people, critics of the U.S. say this vote is another sign of waning influence in the region.
They seem to be oblivious to the fact that the whole region is on fire and that their actions today are not the same as they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
The resolution may have failed in the Security Council, but the vote puts the United States in a very awkward position, acting against its stated opposition to Israeli settlement expansion and also against the positions of virtually every other member state here at the UN. Kristin Salumi, Al Jazeera, the United Nations.
Well, still to come on